start over. Hi, I'm Aaron Kramer. I'm the president and CEO of BSR, and I am delighted to welcome you to this late afternoon twilight dialogue on nature and climate. I would also say welcome to the Business Pavilion here at COP. Thank you for finding it. Not simple, but it's worth it once you get here. So that is very good. BSR is a proud founding member of the We Mean Business Coalition, which is a coalition of 7 organizations working in harmony to help ensure that the ambition loop that we talk about, ambition, action, advocacy, accountability is pursued in service of the Paris objectives. And so thank you very much for coming. We hope that you find the programming at the pavilion to be useful over the next few days in service of a successful COP. We have a few slides, but I will introduce, just tell you who's here. There's something really unique about the wonderful panel we've assembled here. Growing up, I never knew any other Aarons. We have 4 people here today. 3 of them are Aarons. So Keyvan is our commitment to diversity here. Keyvan Macedo from Natura & Co. If we can go ahead to the next slide, we can show who everyone is. Oh, I do that. That's right. Here we are. One of these things is not like the other. For anyone who grew up in the United States, there's a kids' TV show that all of the Aarons spell their names differently, which is fantastic. But you didn't come here to learn about Aaron. You came here to learn about nature. So we'll go on in just a minute. I'll describe BSR in just a minute, which will cover myself and Aaron Lighthizer. Keyvan Macedo is Sustainability Director at Natura & Co., a wonderful company headquartered in Brazil. And Aaron Bloomgarden is the founder and CEO of Emergent, which is also the coordinator of the LEAF Coalition, which I'm sure, Aaron, you will tell us a bit about and as we go through the topic. So a little brief bit about BSR. We're a global nonprofit business network and consultancy working from the United States, Europe, and Asia, and we look at sustainability in a holistic manner, which is really important for today's discussion because we're here at the Climate COP, but we are talking about nature, and these things are integrally related, as we'll get into in just a minute. These are building blocks of climate action that are needed, and let me grab that. So in service of the Paris objectives, I would actually start with net zero business transformation. You hear a lot of talk about climate transition plans over the coming days. They are essential. They are slowly finding their way into the mainstream of business. Actually not so slowly, moving pretty rapidly. Integration into risk management. Which, of course, the TCFD and, for purposes of today's discussion, TNFD as well. Risk is crucial. And we talk here also about value chain. The vast majority of emissions reductions are to be found in Scope 3. It's a massive challenge for companies, really important. And then climate justice. And here again, the integration of different topics. And if you think about the trajectory of climate justice and how far it has come at COPs over the last several years, in a world that is presenting lots of reasons for pessimism, this is a huge example of something that is a reason for optimism, that the world is finally waking up to the fact that we have to have an inclusive energy transition, or we won't have the energy transition because people and communities won't see themselves in it. So, okay, now we'll go for audio justice too in a minute. So a little bit of framing. And COP30, which is in Brazil, so Keyvan, we may talk about that, what we can expect. This is what we're looking to see companies not just commit to, but actually deliver. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, I'm going to the next slide. I don't usually talk to myself, so that's why nothing happened. Okay, you'll be glad to know that that's the last slide I need to advance today. So three key points. I'm actually going to start in the middle. with the tipping points, and both the two points on the right-hand side speak to the fact that by all accounts, we are exceeding the natural boundaries that the planet can deliver. And this is true about climate, but it is fundamentally true about all aspects of nature, whether it's water, oceans, land, etc. And you can see the statistics. 17% of the Amazon rainforest has been lost, and the savannaization that is happening in the Amazon is the most visible example. I was at another event today, and someone posed the question in fact, in this room, to another Brazilian who was speaking, will there be an Amazon left by the time we get to COP30? And the answer was, well, I hope so. I didn't leave that discussion with a great deal of optimism hearing that answer. Of course, there will be, but the trajectory is not what we need it to be, and I don't want to focus only on Brazil. This obviously is universal. Carbon sink to source. So this is a more positive dimension of things, that nature is part of the problem, but it is also, more importantly, a fundamental part of the solution to so many of the questions that we're here to debate, not only preserving biodiversity, not only ensuring the climate keeps the planet habitable, but also that livelihoods are preserved. So this is the framing. There is a twin crisis. Since the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, of course, we had COP15 for nature last December in Montreal. A lot of progress is being made. Benchmarks are being established. The world's attention is on nature. Businesses' attention is increasingly on nature, and we can't solve one of these crises without solving the other. I think we all know that, but I wanted to level set a bit. So with that, you'll be glad to know I'm going to hand the device here off to, we actually have one more Erin at BSR. We didn't bring her along, so thought 2 was more than enough. So Erin Lighthizer, over to you. Oh, I should say, we're going to hear from each of our 3 panelists today for a few minutes, giving different perspectives on the topic at hand. Let's do this informally. I'm going to ask them some questions, but I'd love to have you ask questions or make comments as well. Let's make this as engaged and engaging as we can. Erin.
Thank you. So if you haven't gathered, my name's Erin, and I am an Associate Director of Nature and Climate at BSR. So I get the pleasure of working at this intersection between both, and getting to go to the Nature COP and the Climate COP, and being able to draw these intersections. As well, I'm also on the faculty at Copenhagen Business School, so we'll warn you now, if you're too quiet, I will not fear cold calling. So you've been warned. All right, so I think Erin number 1 set up nicely our, looking at some of the trade-offs and the connections between climate and nature. But I think as we then move this into the business realm, what does this mean for business and what they're facing? So this is a shot from the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. And a couple of things I find really interesting about this. So the first is on the left. When you look at the short-term challenges that we're facing, if you just add up all the green boxes, so all the environmental and climate issues, roughly equals, everything else we're facing. But what I think is even more instructive for us is as we then look to the shift on the right, if we look to see how this is reordered and our long-term risks, what we see rise to the top is really our failure to do something about the twin crisis that we're failing. So our failure to do something about mitigation and engage in adaptation. So really, this is as much a crisis of climate and nature as it is a failure of our own action. So Anthony Gutierrez, as you may have heard, has talked a lot about how making peace with nature is the task of the 21st century for us. So we've begun really getting our arms around climate and what does that mean? And certainly we're not there yet, that's why we're all here. But we are making progress and we are figuring out at least what that path forward looks like. Now we need to do the same for nature. And why? Well, if for no other reason than for climate. So we know that nature needs to deliver about 30% of all climate mitigation in just the next 6-7 years, so not very long. And this is in part because nature-based solutions, they're available now, they're very accessible, for the most part, we know how to implement them, which stands in sharp contrast to more technological approaches, which we may certainly need in the future, direct air capture, carbon capture, and storage, and these sorts of things, but the technology certainly isn't there and not at a scalable pace. And so nature is here and readily available. Okay. So what's the next challenge? Well, the next challenge then is we know we need these nature-based solutions, but we have a large gap when it comes to financing. So the good news is that some of this gap, or even a large part of the gap, can be met through, for example, reforming harmful subsidies, so moving away from fossil fuel and harmful agricultural subsidies into those that are nature positive. And also there are some public instruments, the Global Environmental Facility, the Global Biodiversity Fund, but there still remains quite a significant gap that the private sector will need to pick up. And that will entail scaling investments at least 4 to 5 times from what they are today, if not more. So to really demonstrate that the private sector needs to play a role in mobilizing the finance that we need for nature. How do corporations do this? Well, one of the maybe criticisms that arises, and rightly so, is around the integrity of some nature-based solutions, and particularly of credits. So credits being the mechanism by which companies monetize the purchase of a nature-based solution. And so I'll define a nature-based solution as any nature-based approach that aims to have environmental, social, and economic benefits. And we might think of climate as a subset of that. So while companies need to follow the mitigation hierarchy, absolutely, and avoid and reduce emissions, it's perhaps more helpful to think of this as a prioritization rather than an ordering of activities, because we cannot wait until we are at 2050 or even 2030 before we start making investments in nature, or there won't be much nature left to save, and we won't have the kind of high quality credits available to be able to meet that net zero standard at the end to balance that residual emission once all the others have been reduced. That said, I think it's also very important for us to think about this interaction between climate and nature, because sometimes climate solutions or nature solutions taken in the name of climate, particularly when looking sheerly at that carbon perspective, can actually harm nature and cause these kind of perverse feedback loops also to climate. So I think one of the easy examples of this is thinking about large monoculture plantations. So we hear this with eucalyptus a lot, very fast-growing tree, planted in the name of carbon sequestration. But when we plant monoculture plantations, we're increasing risks of disease, of fire, and really reducing the resilience of the landscape at the same time as really kind of destroying that local biodiversity as well, which in turn reduces the capacities of soil to hold carbon, which is where most of the carbon is held as well. So point being, we need to be very thoughtful and careful about how we approach these. And as well, I think we can become increasingly aware of how this impacts people. So we know that done poorly, nature-based solutions can be harmful to people, and particularly Indigenous people in local communities who could be disenfranchised, or others who get, caught up in the kind of the bad parts of a poorly designed project. But at the same time, we know that there's huge potential for nature to actually help us meet our other goals because of the interaction that nature has with health, with local economies and communities. Okay, so what does this all mean? So, for BSR, we recommend that companies invest in nature-based solutions for nature positive, for net zero, and for resilient business. So the first, net zero, I think we've talked quite a bit about. We know that this is where the mitigation potential lies, and it also can help companies on their path to reaching net zero. They can neutralize emissions. In the meantime, they can begin to address some of those historical emissions, and then be prepared to meet the SBTi net zero standard when they get there. So I think one of the nice examples of this is Velux, the Danish window maker, who has recently made a commitment to counterbalance all emissions historically in their supply chain from the entire history of their company, so that by the time they turn 100, they will have invested enough to mitigate the carbon associated with all operations throughout their lifespan. The next reason companies should engage in nature-based solutions is for nature positive. We know with the global biodiversity framework and our global goals that this is necessary. But even for business, we know that nature presents a very material risk to them. This might be particularly obvious in agricultural supply chains with things like pollinators and being dependent upon water provisioning and these sorts of things. And so it's really in their best interest to invest in nature and the resilience of nature for their own supply chains, to be able to respond to very rapidly developing regulation, and also seize new business opportunities. And then finally, the last is it also provides opportunities to contribute to more resilient business overall. So in Europe, for example, we know that 75% of all bank loans are given to companies that are highly dependent on at least one ecosystem service. So we start to see this very close connection between the ecosystem services and the financial system and the interdependencies between them. We also know that this is a principal way to help address many social sustainability issues, and how do we help uphold the rights and ensure a just and fair transition, and in particular put Indigenous people and local communities who have traditional knowledge and are the stewards of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So how do we put them front and center and bring them together to be able to create a more resilient business ecosystem overall? So an example here is Caring and their regenerative fund that really seeks to bring together corporate investment really to address the kinds of impacts that they're having across the industry, so as a way to help raise the bar industry-wide. So there we are. So thank you very much. Hopefully this provides a bit of a foundation then as we can go to our next speakers, who will then talk more about what this looks like in practice.
So Kayvon and Aaron, why don't you come on up, because we're done with the slides for now, so we can take seats up here. I'm going to go next to Kayvon Macedo, whom I introduced a little while ago. Kayvon from Natura & Co., a company that has been focused on taking care of nature from its very inception. So Kayvon, tell us a little bit about how you think about it.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Aaron, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure, of course, to attend this panel, and also to bring some diversity, at least on the name of the panelists. So I think that let me start offering some perspectives about Natura & Co., the group, and of course covering a little bit more about Natura Cosméticos, the mother company of our group. So basically we are a cosmetic group that operate in 100 markets, mainly focused, of course, in Latin America, where Natura was found in the end of the 60s. And I think that the choice of the name of the brand, it was because it was a choice of the founder, that how to be inspired by nature. So the words in English and in Portuguese are very similar. Natureza, nature, natural, natural and natural. So natura, it's a close meaning to natural. And since the beginning, of course, there is this concern about how we can try to minimize the impact that we have on nature side, as well as try to have natural ingredients, which was not the trend that we have seen in the end of the 60s or beginning of the 70s. There is an opposite trend on the beauty sector, try to introduce synthetic ingredients. So I think it was the first thing. Second, it was the beginning of the 80s. There is this launch, what we call the refill packaging. And the purpose of the refill, it was not, of course, it has the benefit, of course, to minimize the environmental impact, but originally it was to have the loyalty of the consumers in order for them to acquire and to purchase the same products with a much more simple packaging, and of course have 20 to 30% discount. But I think that the shift of the business of Natura became with a brand that we call Ecos in Portuguese, or Ecos, that was introduced in the year 2000. But the inspiration of the line came in a very important global meeting hosted in Brazil in 1992 called the Earth Summit. After the summit, the founders, they gathered themselves and they discussed about what could be the contributions that our business model could give to nature. And of course, when we are talking about Brazil, the most important biome that we have in the region is the Amazon rainforest. And Amazon rainforest, even though that belongs to 9 countries, the majority of the Amazon rainforest is in Brazil. So therefore, how we can use this? In the other hand, I think that Natura has learned that sustainability not only has the 3 dimensions, the economic, the social, and environmental, but also the cultural dimension. And I think that we have seen a lot about indigenous people, local communities discussion, especially in Kunming, Montreal conference last year. And we knew that those local people, they have what we call the traditional knowledge. How we can develop new products inspired by this knowledge. How we can introduce the Brazilian biodiversity to the Brazilian citizenship. But actually, we not only introduced to the Brazilian citizenship, but of course, around the globe. And that is one of the examples. This is one of our products. It's a hand cream. Someone in the audience will be your lucky day because you're going to get this as a sample. And why I choose this one specific, because even for us, Brazilian, the name is very difficult to pronounce. Its name is ucuba. It's a very small seed that has this property of moisturize. So what we study with the local community is that in the past, those communities were selling the wood, so they are chopping down the tree to sell the wood to produce broomsticks. And we realized that based on the property of these raw ingredients, we could increase the income for the local communities. And in the end, nowadays, by purchasing, using the principles of fair trade of those seeds, we can pay to the communities 3 times more than they were receiving just to chop down the trees. And the most interesting part, it was something that we have the leadership of the women inside the communities, because in the beginning, those seeds, because of course the communities are living in very close to the river, and by night, because of the tides of course increase, and they collect the seeds and go then to the river. So the women needs, of course, to catch these over the boats, and they have the patience. And they taught their men to say that, guys, this is going to increase the income that we are going to have. And one of the things that when we live in the urban cities that we do not figure out, that even the ones that live in the forest, they want prosperity, financial prosperity. Maybe the level of prosperity that they want or they are seeking is totally different from the ones that live in the urban center. But I think that it's important to realize that. So it was a project that we are very proud because, of course, we connect this. Ucuba was listed on the red list of IUCN as a threatened species in the end of the 90s. Nowadays, it's not anymore due to these kind of projects. So one of the things that we are advocating for, not only in CBD COP15, but also in the previous COP, is that we need to create the conditions to increase what we are calling the economy of the standing forest. So we can have more prosperity, we can preserve, and if you take a look about one of the graphics that Erin number 2, she presented, we have a strong benefit about preserving the forest. That is the point. And sometimes we are talking about a high integrity forest, something that was not managed before. And those local communities or those indigenous populations are the ones that are true guardians of the forest. They have been living in balance, in harmony with nature. We are the ones, of course, demanding a lot of stuff, and we have this situation. And one of the lessons learned that we had across these last more than 20 years that we have operating with this specific brand is that you need to have trust with the local communities. Therefore, we established a team that is based in the north part of Brazil. Of course, not during the pandemic period, but they need to spend 80% of their time on the field. They need to give a technical assistance to the communities, but they need to understand what are the needs of the communities in order for us to improve a little bit our business model. So I think that with that, I'm going to stop talking, but it was a nice example about how with a simple solutions, we can develop a sustainable business model, and we can address the social and environmental challenge that we are facing nowadays.
Thank you, Kevon. Really interesting, makes it very real, and it's. I hadn't known the whole story, that some of the thinking that has infused itself into Natura's model came immediately after the Earth Summit in Rio. So great things can come from these big gatherings. So I ask everyone to go create a new business model after COP28. Aaron Bloomgarden, tell us a little bit about your work, and maybe say a little bit about the LEAF Coalition as well, both both emergent in the coalition.
And I do feel like we're making history today. The first panel, maybe in history, with 3 Aarons on it. It's really exciting. So, and congratulations to everyone for finding this booth. It was a challenge, I think, for me, for sure, after a long flight. Look, I have an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old boys at home, and I think if you ask them, and most grade school kids, like, what is the top thing, the number one thing you could do for the environment? And they would say, plant a tree, right? I mean, I think, so the nice thing about nature-based solutions is it's very intuitive. And I think, actually, probably most people who aren't they would, most adults would also say that. I think what is lost on most adults, and actually probably most of the people at this conference, is that the role of nature is not only to plant trees and create new forests and to sequester carbon, but we have a problem with deforestation, right? So deforestation is, depending on the year, between 10 to 20% of emissions, right? Take away even the ability for a growing forest to capture carbon, we've got it is a massive source of emissions. So it's actually, if it were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter behind China and the US. So just like we can't have a rational climate strategy without dealing with the US emissions, Chinese emissions, transportation emissions, we cannot achieve the Paris Agreement goals without getting to zero deforestation, full stop, right? So that is the first thing to keep in mind, and part of the animating thesis behind LEAF. Second is, how do you do it? And I remember being a student in grad school studying sustainability. I studied with Jeff Sachs, that some of you may know, and I remember like after the 10th lecture of, here's like the sky is falling, right? Global challenge, climate catastrophe, this, that. I said, enough. Like, what is the solution? What's the unified theory of solutions, right? And he said to me something that I think has now set me off in this trajectory, which is we need to change incentives. I mean, it's a very simple, pretty intuitive. We need to change incentives on the ground, and I think Kevin had a really good example of changing incentives, right? You need, right? People, rational, basic economics are rational actors, respond to incentives. So fundamentally, we need to give a value to standing forests and standing ecosystems. The challenge, or the problem, I would say, is most of these standing ecosystems don't have a good business model to keep them intact. This, Kevin's example is great, but they're way too few and far in between. So we need to find a way to basically pay for forests, in my view, to keep forests standing, to reverse deforestation. So that's what we're trying to do with the LEAF Coalition. So what is LEAF? It stands for Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance. And so it is really, truly a public-private partnership. That's building off of 15 years of REDD+, which was launched in COP13, I think, in Bali. And REDD+, for those of you who don't know, stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation, Degradation, and Sustainable Forest Management.
Aaron, can you try to hold the mic a little closer?
Oh, sorry.
Because I know we're recording. So.
Sorry. So we're building off of 15 years of both technical and political negotiations around REDD+. And the basic premise is that we need to create a demand signal that can pay forest countries that are able to reduce emissions from lowering deforestation, basically protecting their forests. So LEAF in Glasgow, COP26, we announced that we had collected over $1 billion in commitments from what now is 26 large corporations and 3 donor governments, US, UK, and Norway, who are all committing to purchase verified emission reductions from forest protection in tropical forest countries. We're very intentional. I don't know, maybe we can get into a conversation about voluntary carbon markets. I've been in voluntary carbon markets for almost 20 years now, and there are some real pitfalls in voluntary carbon markets. And so we tried to structure this in such a way that it really addressed, right, this is too important a mission that to fail because of some of these other. So we structured Emergent as a nonprofit which is the coordinator, because people don't, it may not be appropriate for people to get rich off carbon credits, right? Second, we were, I think, the first initiative to create criteria on buyers. So corporates need to pass a set of criteria to prove that they are doing what they can do within their own operations to reduce emissions. Our funders also funded the development of a new standard, high integrity jurisdictional standard called Architecture for Red Transactions. And maybe this is, I'll talk briefly about jurisdictional. So this is, I think, this was a very important shift that we decided early on, which is we were going to focus on jurisdictional programs. So, for the history of voluntary carbon, it's really been about projects. And so we said, what we need to do if we're going to get to the scale that we need to shift to jurisdictional, meaning one simple way to think about it is the whole country or state becomes the project area. That solves a lot of issues around some of the technical issues around leakage, et cetera. It also gives us the scale that we need. It also happens to be aligned with this UNFCCC process. So that was an important decision. So there's a lot more, and I'd be thrilled to have Q&A and a discussion. Where are we going? We've proved at Glasgow and over the last year, we proved, we think, the demand side thesis with $1 billion in demand, which is a lot in the context of voluntary carbon markets, but we know a drop in the bucket for what we need to solve this problem. So now we are tomorrow going to be announcing the first supply transactions. So that now proves concept that we've got now the platform to do this at scale. And so now it's about scaling. Our hope is that in the next year plus we can 10x the scale that we're operating on. Of course, that's going to require the markets to cooperate, but we're really excited. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Pardon me, I've got some questions, but let me see if there's a question or two. Very good, and tell us who you are. So, yeah, how do we do this? Yeah. Do we have a mobile mic we do. Everything is possible at COP28.
Hi, my name's Catherine Quinn. I'm from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. My question's mainly for Keivan. I was wondering, what you were describing sounds a lot like community co-design, which obviously is part of just transition principles. And I was just wondering, in terms of the kind of broader discussion about scaling these initiatives, but also incentives, what you thought about how we can incentivize community co-design and also do that as we scale up these initiatives, and how do we get businesses to do that? Do we need a treaty? Do we need some principles? What are your thoughts on how we achieve that?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, you're totally right. I think that the major challenge is how we can use this kind of example to scale up, especially for commodities, because then we will shift the needle. What we have seen so far, and we have been working in this project about agroforestry system solutions for palm, is how, of course, to make this kind of combination to have better resilience and therefore, of course, have this diversity between different species. And we have been applying this in Brazil. Of course, it has been a challenge, of course, to convince producer that for so many years, of course, they do monoculture, but has been proven in the south of Bahia, when they need, of course, to plant again cocoa. It was the only solutions allowed because, of course, for several reasons, We decreased the production of cocoa in Brazil due to one of the plagues that was brought in purpose, of course, to decline the production due to the prices and so on. But I think that that example that we are showing, especially in the last few years that we have all this effect about climate change, proof with data, and now it's much more a matter to convince cultural aspects from small farm holders, and much more to create a financial mechanism in order to make this kind of conversion. I think that is the point that we are still struggling, is to create this financial model in order for them, of course, to make this shift.
Thank you. Another question from the audience now? All right. Oh, yeah. Actually, let me ask a quick follow-up, and then we'll go to you. So, and this is for any and all of you. I think what you're talking about, Keyvan, in terms of engaging with communities, my observation, and I'm not as deep into the subject as the three of you, is that there's a clash of cultures, that large corporates don't always think with the same timescales and incentive structures as some of the local communities. You spoke, Aaron Lighthizer, of indigenous peoples and local communities. What advice would you give in terms of making those kinds of dialogues, that kind of cooperation, work effectively? It's kind of a big question, but...
Okay, I'm going to start. The lesson learned that we have from our side is that don't treat communities as a regular supplier. You cannot pay them in the same period that you pay traditional suppliers, like 90 to 100 days. I think that also establish these close relations about trust. Especially, of course, if you're talking about REDD+ projects, there is a very specific and technical terminology called free
prior informed consent.
Which is something that we need to understand for each one of the words, that we need to do this based on the culture of the community that you are dealing. And I can offer this very simple example that a few years ago we are trying to acquire a REDD+ project from an indigenous communities in Colombia, and the communities were not in favor to sell the credits if they do not know us better. And we said, okay, what we need to do for you know us better, you need to stay with us for some few days. And I said, okay, who is going to do it? And the sustainability manager stay with them for an entire week, living inside the community and chatting with them the entire day. And after this 1 week, he almost quit the job that we have inside Natura, but also there is this trust established, and then they agree about selling the credits.
I can add. So you mentioned FPIC, free prior informed consent. You know, we've learned some lessons along the way as well. And you know, when we started, we thought, you know, okay, we've got, you know, FPIC, we've got the Cancun safeguards, we've got a benefit sharing plan. Okay, check, check, check. And I think is that everything's in order. Great. And I think the feedback that we got from the indigenous and local community groups was that's great, but we don't want to be box checked, right? We want to be part of the overall design. We want to be partners in this. And so that's really, I think, changed the way we think about this. And so we're always, right, insofar as we can, we're always thinking about how do we integrate, let's say, IPLCs into, whether it's on our board, whether it's in the program design, whether it's in conversations. We're always now much more aware of thinking about that.
You want to add?
Yeah, maybe I can just follow up, because I think those are both such great examples. And I think one of the kind of key takeaways in places where I think we can get a little off is that we often think about IPLCs and engaging them when it comes to the solutions. But I think really we should take a step back and think about how do we involve them in defining what is the problem and how are they experiencing the problem. Because I think that then leads us to a whole different maybe way or a different path or even set of solutions. And so I think, you know, even starting that process at the beginning, which helps to build trust, if nothing else, you know, even if we've nailed what the problem is. So I think thinking about, you know, that approach and when do we start and who gets to decide what at what point, as much as we can drive towards community, I think problem definition and problem solving, you know, the yeah, the better then more holistic the solutions will be.
Terrific. I think we have a question over here.
Hi, my name's Aoife, also from Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. I was going to ask a question about Indigenous peoples and local communities and how to bring them along, but I've been really inspired by your answers on that. So instead, I'm going to pivot and ask a bit about the technical and governance challenges that we're hearing from our businesses on nature-based solutions as a storage source. So particularly concerns around double counting. If you're protecting forests, is that an additional form of carbon sequestration or not, and should it count? And additionally, the fact that it's not always a permanent storage. So how do you manage that within the context of other kind of mitigation solutions? Thanks. That's probably further to Aaron's.
I feel like this is a really good one for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the permanence, permanence has been dealt with. In let's say carbon projects, there's been a solution that now we use also in the jurisdictional approach, which is it basically amounts to a buffer pool. So every time credits are issued, there's a certain percentage that would be held back and put into a buffer pool in case of reversal, right? So that tends to be the accepted approach to deal with permanence. We would argue that that risk is also less at a jurisdictional level, right? The risk of a project, let's say, getting reversed is a lot greater in our view than a whole jurisdiction. In terms of the additionality, again, I think that's also helped with a jurisdictional approach. And one of the criticisms of REDD+ projects has been the let's say the ability of project developers to, let's say within the standard, to define their own baseline. In other words, cherry pick years, cherry pick how they're, make lots of decisions in the quantification of the baseline that helps optimizes their credit yield. The way the ART standard works sort of removes that because it just looks at a 5-year historic deforestation rate, and that becomes the baseline. There's no cherry picking, and it's across the whole jurisdiction, right? And so we know that these are, these reductions would be additional because we're experienced historically that they haven't been happening.
Maybe I'll just add, if that's okay. So I think the other helpful way, I think, to think about it is thinking beyond just the carbon benefits, which are huge, but also what are the other biodiversity benefits or benefits to local communities. And so in the kind of burgeoning biodiversity credits market, I think the kind of methodologies that we see evolving there would adopt what's called kind of a basket of metrics approach. So how do you look at various things around maybe it's habitat intactness, species counts of different kinds, right? To then start to get at different aspects of the entire health and services of the ecosystem. So you have carbon, which is one and very important metric, but then you start to also look at the other kinds of value that you get. What sort of value are you getting to biodiversity, to local communities, local economies? So I think also broadening the kind of way that we evaluate those credits and what we're looking at is really, really helpful as well if we are, again, to address multiple issues using nature.
Yes, a couple in the back row there.
Hi.
You must be from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
Okay.
Is your name Aaron?
In my previous this thing with KPMG, we had a partnership with them. That's the nearest I go.
Good. Okay, you can proceed then.
Yeah. So, that qualifies. Okay. Thanks. My name is Santosh Jairam, and I am currently associated with a technology company at SailTech. My question is, if you really look at the economies of many of the countries, including Brazil or India or Spain or any other place, the MSMEs are a critical mass. And of course, big companies, you can definitely sway them to many of these things. And many of these MSMEs are dependent on the natural resources as well in various pockets, and they are spread more than the bigger companies, to be very precise. So is there a movement in that direction, or are we missing it?
Well, I can tell you, when we are talking about, even though that Nasuro is a big company, that when we work with those communities, we are talking about very, very small farmholders. And I do consider that in some of the cases, when we are trying to add more revenues to the baskets of the communities, we try to develop some initiatives with small startups, especially with the new generations. So in some of the cases, one of the projects, it was an ecosystem, payment on ecosystem service, and we need to map exactly the GPS location for each one of the properties and each one of the areas that are doing the agroforestry system solutions. Of course, we have training and we have development and local startups in order to do it. So it seems to me that those SMEs could join those initiatives because in the end of the day, it's something that not necessarily needs to be a big company to make the funding. And in some of the cases, of course, they don't need, of course, to customize a solution for their own needs.
So, when we talk about projects, we do bundle. On the buyer side, do we bundle?
Yeah, so for us, because we're really aiming at large scale, we've been focused on large multinational companies that can make large scale commitments. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity in the SMEs on the demand, let's say on the demand side. And actually, a lot of the companies that that are committing to leave are actually, in a sense, we look at them almost as channel partners. So we've got some companies that are saying, hey, we're going to open up to we're going to use part of the way we're going to use these credits is to provide them and resell them to our value chain, right? Our suppliers, our customers. What we've done actually in also the design that I was mentioning earlier, in terms of the integrity, is we've also said, if you sell that at a profit, any profit needs to go back, get funneled back to the communities, right? So, but I'll give you an example, and we don't know what their plans are necessarily, but Amazon, is very intuitive, right? Amazon has over 1 million companies, right? They could easily, they'd be far better at aggregating SMEs or even individuals than any carbon project developer or carbon reseller.
Hi, I'm Deepika. I'm also from one of the technology companies. My question is to Kevan. To begin with, it was very inspiring and amazing to listen the story, how you were empowering the community. You are empowering the community while also developing your product and bringing it to the market. So my question to you is from a consumer's perspective. And also, so basically my question is two parts. First part is that as a consumer, I understand that it becomes my responsibility also to support community or support marginalized section of the society. So while I do so, I also believe, and I've read it in one of the case studies, that while we contribute to that particular issue of society, we also probably, and it's not for Natura particularly, but for any product, any cosmetic thing in the market, we are also in a way making richer, and the amount or the effort that is gone in making richer is way more than the benefit that has actually gone to the community. And this is in general that I want to know, as a consumer, is there a metric, is there a standard through which as a consumer I know that I'm really doing it for the community and not just falling for any marketing gimmick? Because you would agree that a lot of products are being sold and are being branded in a way that they contribute to sustainability, they empower community, they empower women. So as a consumer, we need to know that which product or which service that we are taking is really benefiting the community more than benefiting the product owner. Yeah.
And by the way, regulators are paying much closer attention to some of the claims in consumer communications as well.
Yeah, good question. First, I think that in the end of the day, even though that you add so many environmental benefits about the development of your products, if you do not deliver a high quality performance, the consumer are not going to acquire your products. We have seen it. It's not because, of course, you have so many positive impact that they are going to acquire just because of those impacts. I think that second, to answer you, if I go back to Sharm el-Sheikh, I remember that I was attending one of the panel and suddenly someone raised a hand, of course, to make a question. And I noticed it was a Brazilian. And then she was explaining a little bit, and it was a panel, the previous panelists were governors of states of Brazil. And then there is a private sector speaking in the second, I was among them. And she was telling about these benefits that we deliver about prosperities. So one of the measures that we are trying to do is that what is the living wage payment that we offer to these communities? Because of course in Brazil, if they consider it's a minimum wage to living wage, it's at least 3 times more. And second, what is the level of prosperity that we generate? So some of the benefits that we offer, especially about access and benefit sharing that we need to pay by using the traditional knowledge, sometimes by the contract that we made the communities, we cannot pay directly to each one of the families. We need to pay to the community. So normally we are building a school or any kind of facilities that is going to benefit everyone that is living over there. So I would say that in this sense, we have also these other indicators that try to support, based on the business model that we create, what is the size of the Amazon regions that we can claim that we are protecting because of the families has a different source of income instead of going and chopping down the trees.
Let me throw a question at you. I'm pretty convinced that everyone in this room is bought into the concepts that we're talking about. So let's assume an imaginary C-suite official or board member walks in and says, I don't know, I read that New Yorker article about that project in Africa, and even my chief sustainability officer is saying, we're not really sure these projects deliver benefits. Why should we spend money on this stuff? Because we're not sure it's doing any good, and it may create consumer backlash, it may create regulatory interest. How do you answer the cynics? Because, there's been a lot of pushback, some of it justified, some of it not, but that's the elephant in the room.
Shall I have a go, and then you guys can weigh in? Yeah, so I think, particularly for the C-suite, I think where this is hitting the most is really realizing what their dependencies are in nature, and particularly tying this back to the finances. So I think we're seeing a lot of interest, particularly amongst financial services companies, who are really realizing that they have a lot of embedded risks in their portfolios, given dependencies on nature. And so I think, even just from a very fundamental perspective about de-risking your business and de-risking your supply chain, companies really do need to rely on looking at this and addressing these issues. And then also, as we discussed too, to be able to reach net zero, both individually and overall, to be able to have access to high integrity, good quality credits to be able to meet that residual left that they have remaining when they reach their net zero target through SBTI. But in the meantime, being able to address some of their historical issues with carbon emissions and be able to address some of those problems as well, which I think really helps to, bolster their credibility. So I think one of the things that many analyses have come out with lately, given all of the controversies in the carbon market, is looking at who's buying carbon credits. And it actually is companies, by and large, there's some exceptions, of course, but by and large, who are taking pretty bold and much more progressive action than other companies. So we do know that this is associated with being leading. And so, get on the bandwagon. This is where it's going.
I do think it is risky for a company to be involved in a one-off carbon project. It is, even with good standards and hopefully like ICVCM and these new standard setters are hoping to, and the new VCS guidelines, hopefully this solves some of it. But it's very hard to know, especially for a company whose business is not developing carbon projects. I mean, it's very hard to know not only the integrity of the quantification of the carbon, but also the proponents. Are they credible? And so there are some good projects, and I've probably invested in or developed as many carbon projects as anyone in the world, and I'm a big fan of projects. But this is the reason why we've moved to a jurisdictional approach, right? And I think, and so maybe this is a good point, a good moment for me to articulate kind of how I view the future, or how, at least how I think the future of the carbon market should evolve. To me, carbon, paying for carbon offsets, it's not easily won money within a corporation, right? And I think, first, to me, the highest and best use of that is to preserve ecosystems, whether it's forests or mangroves, or because they don't have other sources of revenue, and they've got all these great co-benefits that we've talked about. Second, I think a company should be thinking about how do we leverage our dollars as part of a larger impact. And this is, and that might be through a coalition, but a strategy that can actually move the needle on climate and biodiversity, right? And at scale. And then the third point is, I think integrity does not end with the with the supply side, with the quantification of the baseline and the actual carbon credits. I think a mistake that some in the carbon markets, like the task force has initially made, is just viewing carbon as another asset class, another tradable asset, but if we had all of the tools of capital markets, this could scale. No, carbon is a unique asset because of the value is the impact. The value is not getting delivered for some input like any other commodity. So integrity needs to only begin at the supply side, but it has to carry, in my view, it has to carry through the whole value chain in the way it's traded, who's buying it, the claims that are being made about it, right? And so I think that's but if we can get all that right, and I think carbon finance has the potential to really move the needle on, and I believe it can not alone, but it can have a big impact on getting us to zero deforestation.
Keyvan, do you want to touch on that?
If I may just complement, because I totally agree, it's a matter about establishing the right procedures inside the company, because in the end of the day, we realize across those years that we have been acquiring carbon credits that some of our competitors and even our suppliers, when we are trying to engage them to do the same procedures, we are seeing that they want just to seek for price. It was the only criteria they were taking a look. And that is the reason that for so many years, we struggle a little bit to try to have the suppliers on board. And what we decided by COP21 in Paris, it was why we cannot create our own network, our own platform, because then we can engage other players and our suppliers in order to have a process that we can standardize the process. And another thing that we struggle is the fact that our accounting systems were complaining about why you pay different price for each one of the projects. And then we are bringing this kind of evaluation about each one of the projects deliver different co-benefits. So we created this internal tool about the ROI, the return of the investments, in order to quantify exactly the impact that the project is generated to the local communities. In some of the cases, we are going to pay a lower price, but we are going to receive a lower co-benefit. In some of the cases, we are paying high prices, and we are going to receive a very high co-benefit impact. So I think in the end, it's a balance, because of course, we have a limitation about the budgets, so we need to balance about the different type of project that we can acquire, but definitely we can understand if these, let's say, premium price, worth or not to pay.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to skip COP29, and let's pretend that we're in Brazil for COP30. We've got about 2 minutes. In 30 seconds or less, what would each of you like to see in terms of an exciting marker of progress by the time COP30 rolls around?
Look, I mean, I would love to see voluntary carbon markets start looking a bit more like compliance carbon markets. I mean, just to give you order of magnitude, voluntary carbon markets, ecosystem marketplace came out last year was a $2 billion market, $2 billion, right? That's a very small market. Even compliance carbon, right? Regulated carbon, cap and trade systems in Europe, California, it's $900 billion market, right? So order of magnitude, and that's largely because of why I think that's important is largely because you need the hook on the demand side, right? You need to get companies to actually commit to taking this action, and there's a real bite to it. I think there are ways to do it. On our side, I'd love to be able to announce, right, that we've got Brazil on board in LEAF. We're up to 10 billion plus in our on corporate commitments. That's what I'd like to.
Great. Who's next? Oh, you're going last, Keyvan. Yeah.
Yeah, he should go last. Yeah. I agree. All right. I would say also I'm very much looking forward to, even in this COP, getting greater clarity on Article 6, because I'm hoping that will solve some of these issues, because I agree. I think it's a little bit Wild West right now, and having I think just clearer parameters, what counts, what doesn't, what are those integrity thresholds, I think will be really helpful. I think the other thing I would really like to see, I think, is a greater, coming together between the climate and nature agendas. So following Montreal and the passage of the Global Biodiversity Framework last year and the Global Biodiversity Fund, it feels like there's a lot of overlap in the things we're trying to achieve. So how can we come together to identify those synergies and really be able to scale solutions that work for both?
Okay, Kayvon.
Yeah, you know that because all this uncertainty about COP29, I have been here a lot about the road between Dubai to Belém. A lot the recently days because I have been attending another event pre-COP. I would say that my word is going to be legacy. In the end of the day, we need to create any kind of mechanism to create a legacy of sustainable development for the Amazon regions and for the entire country. We have seen a lot of experience, if you take in consideration sports about Olympic Games, World Cups, that there is no legacy that we left after this kind of event. It is going to be a shame, and I know that President Lula, when he suggested to host the COP30 in Belém and hosted this in the Amazon regions, it's for, of course, the head of the states and the civil society to debate about the future of the planet, consider the inspiration of Mother Nature. So I think that is the point. We need to create an event that will generate legacy. And I think that is the thing that we are going to advocate across this COP in order to create these programs. Otherwise, I don't think it's going to work. We are going to face several challenges to host an event for this magnitude, about 45 to 50,000 people, but we need to create legacy.
That is excellent. We're going to, such a great final comment, we're going to give you the honorary title of Aaron for the rest of the day. I want to thank you all. I'm sorry we didn't get to this side of the room. This must be the Oxford side of the room as opposed to the Cambridge side of the room. But please join me in giving a warm round of applause for our three wonderful speakers.
And who wants school?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Can you make a bridal bouquet?